Hello, welcome to International Trade with David Ricardo, Dick Cheney, and this piece from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, Volume 9, Number 2. Um, David Ricardo was born in London in 1772, one of 17 children. His parents were Sephardic Jews who had emigrated to England. So we would now ask, who wrote this? Do you know who wrote this? Right. So we're going to take a few steps back and talk about theories, where they come from, how they develop, what it means to the individual. And David Ricardo. Um, so Dick Cheney taught David Ricardo at in Texas, I think, probably Montana. Um, and he must have written this, right? Um, there's no, so this is by Robert Formani, right? He must be Italian, a senior economist. Um, so now we'll move to the left. So economic insights, right? And this is about bias, something called subjective bias, right? Now it looks like The Economist. However, it seems like red is perhaps a bias of mine. Few ideas have been as widely accepted by economists and as roundly rejected by many other people as the doctrine of free international trade. So this was by Langston Hughes, who worked at the Federal Reserve in Dallas. He really focused on something called moving with your feet, a different form of trade. Economists base their acceptance of the mutual benefits from such trade on a concept called comparative advantage. One is the development of theories. David Ricardo. Although his career in the field of political economy was brief, Ricardo was a person. Today, world trade agreements like Mars attacks on Facebook.com, the physical location and relocation, especially relocation, of firms doing business across national borders. In light of these developments, we offer this latest economic insight on the life and ideas of one of free trade's most ardent theoretical defenders. So when you come up with a theory, right? So Tupac Shakur, Langston Hughes, named this book, right? So is it then it was published in 1810? That's a claim that's in this piece by the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. From me making content, me being a human being, I think it's unlikely that David Ricardo was one of 17 children. I find that fact unlikely, you know. Um, it then jumps to he read, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, you know. So it's odd to me. So I'm going to stick with my theory, which is what the basis of this is, which is how is comparative advantage and absolute advantage in international trade probably a new field, considering the IMF is not real, right? Are the Supreme Justices real, right? So, what underpinning of justice do you have for yourself in terms of theories, right? And that's best by reading primary sources. This is from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. I have been reading the actual textbook. Dick Cheney was a member of the US Congress and was George Bush's vice president, an ardent hiker, and a serious sushi guy, from what I understand. I went to Brandeis University. Brandeis was named after Louis Brandeis, much like the school on the Upper West Side, the law school at Louisville. I've studied all three. And I understand Louis Brandeis to be Langston Hughes's father. Therefore, I'm able to tell this story. Um, so in 1814, Ricardo retired from business life in Gloucester. A year later, he published his next major work in economics, essays on the influence of a low price of corn on the profits of stock. Again, I recently posted something on Helen McDonald's on corn laws. Corn laws are like, do British people understand tea? The Tea Party, right? The Boston Tea Revolution. No taxation without representation. And that's kind of what this is, in the sense of, if you think about high fructose corn syrup, or um, I guess, what's it called, ethanol, in Brazil. Do they put sugar cane in gas prices? Gas prices are through the roof. Is OPEC real? Does Saudi Arabia control American oil prices? Um, and so, one thing to think about is, Tesla reported their earnings. And my guess, based on a model I built on the internet for after hours stock prices, is that I think, probably 4%. Tesla goes down 4%. Um, so, are earnings important when my guess is just due to gas prices? Tesla would fall anyways. You know, I recently walked to a fire station, and there was one of those SUVs. Those SUVs look like, Heinrich Himmler is sleeping in it. So I don't know. It seems like those are kind of menaces. They're menacing Teslas. Tesla's electric. That's true. So, you know, so then why? Why? And that's probably because electric and gas aren't so different these days. Electric, gas, and water, all utilities. Um, Another reason would be, do people lie about how long? I had a hybrid car. It went 30 miles fully charged for 8 hours, right? So I would charge it overnight, then it would go 30 miles. So that's not that much. Where are these charging stations? We've seen the parking lots. I haven't really seen people use them. You have to pay. You have to pay for gas things. I thought wind. I love that scene where Josh crashes the Tesla SUV. Um, so then who's the CEO of Tesla, right? It could be Donald Rumsfeld. He was one person who claimed to be. Ryan Phillippe claimed to be. Um, Others were Nikola Tesla, right? The famed Ukrainian. Michael Jordan threw his hat in the ring, I think. Anyways, each country naturally devotes its capital and labor, right? So there's two inputs in, usually, I guess, a production function or some output. The amount of things you put in it, right? And the amount of time. So capital and labor. This pursuit of an individual is creates a good by stimulating industry, by rewarding ingenuity, and by efficaciously the peculiar powers bestowed by nature. Right, it distributes labor most effectively and most economically, while increasing the general mass of productions. It diffuses general benefit and binds together by one common tie of interest or intercourse. Along with absolute advantage, you would have an absolute disadvantage, right? So if your absolute advantage is writing things down, your absolute disadvantage might be speaking, right? So if you were to think, for instance, if you had $100, right? If it all went to labor and zero went to capital, it would be on the y-axis at 100. If it's the opposite and it went to labor, I guess, it would be on the x axis and it would be at $100. On the other hand, if you think economically or efficiently, you might be able to get to somewhere in between them on a curved line. And that's some type of production function or just budget. That's a budget, right? You have $100, you get to eat so much food. That's, maybe capital. You get to see so many friends. That's labor. That's labor, right? So that's one way to think about your day. Ricardo's purpose in exploring the issue of land rents was British legislation called the Corn Laws. Passed in 1815, those laws forbade the importance into England of food grown elsewhere and sought to maintain rising prices. So when we think about totalitarian economies, they're closed economies. That's one criticism of of closed economies, which is they you want, generally you want trade. From everything you've learned in economics, you want trade, right? So that's a statement. I'd have to prove it just to give you an example. The protectionist corn laws were an attempt to maintain the agricultural status quo after Napoleon's defeat and return to peaceful conditions. Ricardo, himself a landowner who was profiting from rising rents, nevertheless argued that corn laws should not be enacted after they were continued to argue strenuously for their appeal. This was an argument to skip down for rent on the extensive margin, right? So we were talking about contribution margin. And that's one of the things about rent, staying power or buying power. Whereas if you move with your feet, for Langston Hughes's um, theory, you have a contribution margin, right? In Keynesianism, there's a high margin of change, right? So, there's a lot about in economics, it's a dog eat dog world, right? Taxation impedes growth, and its incidence falls not necessarily where the law stays. There are no taxes which have not a tendency to lessen the power to accumulate. All taxes must either fall on capital or revenue. If they, again, right, capital or revenue, and now we introduce a third, which is technology, right? So if capital is like a horse or like an asset, technology would be like a software, right? Is that capital? Not necessarily. So one thing you could do is tax, not capital gains, but productivity gains in software development, an electronic tax.